Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the recent Supreme Court ruling in Trump v. Slaughter, and honestly, its implications for the federal government are absolutely massive. Now, if you follow the news, you already know this is a hugely debated topic. But today, we're going to skip the spin and look strictly at the data and arguments presented in our source material by economist Peter St. Onge. We'll be exploring exactly how this ruling could completely reshape the balance of power in Washington.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're breaking this down into 5 clear steps: the Supreme Court's shockwave, inside the independent agencies, the rise of the administrative state, the shift in power, and finally, what we're all wondering about, the future economic implications. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the Supreme Court's shockwave. So, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in Trump v. Slaughter to actually allow the president to fire thousands of independent federal bureaucrats. And what's really fascinating here is just the sheer scope of that decision. We aren't just talking about a few political appointees at the very top. We're talking about a ruling that completely redefines the executive branch's authority over a massive workforce, a workforce that historically operated with a pretty significant degree of independence from the Oval Office. To really capture the magnitude of this, economist Peter St. Onge uses some incredibly strong language in our source material. He claims this ruling literally gutted one of the load-bearing walls of the deep state. Now, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, St. Onge's phrasing here points to a fundamental reality. For decades, there has been this structural wall separating these federal workers from direct presidential control. And, well, this ruling essentially takes a sledgehammer to that wall. To understand exactly why this is such a monumental shift, we have to look back at a case called Humphrey's Executor. For nearly a century, this 90-year-old legal precedent is what protected independent agency heads and workers from just being fired by the president at will. Overturning a 90-year-old precedent? That's rare. And doing so fundamentally rewires how the federal government functions on a day-to-day basis. Moving on to step 2, inside the independent agencies. Let's look under the hood. According to St. Onge, this alphabet soup of federal agencies basically controls the whole shebang. You've got the FTC managing corporate mergers, you have the SEC, CFTC, and FDIC, which honestly sounds like a terrible hand in Scrabble, right? But they control finance and banking. The FCC oversees communications, and FERC regulates energy markets. These aren't just abstract acronyms floating around in D.C. They dictate the rules for the banks you use, the energy that powers your home, and the media you consume every single day. So the crucial point here is the scale of their authority, and it is perfectly captured by this single number, 90%. The source points out that almost 90% of our laws are actually written by these unelected bureaucrats, rather than by the politicians we actually elect to Congress. When you realize that 90% of federal rules are drafted by the very people who up until recently couldn't easily be fired by the president, well, you start to understand why the Slaughter decision is such a massive, massive structural shift. Which brings us to part 3. The rise of the administrative state. How exactly did we get here? St. Onge frames this historical evolution with a highly critical lens. He describes it as a long-standing push to turn government into, and I quote, a self-licking ice cream cone. In his view, the bureaucracy was essentially designed to serve itself in its own policy goals, completely insulated from the shifting winds of presidential elections or, voter preferences. And the source traces exactly how that insulation was built, piece by piece. The foundation was actually laid way back in 1883 with the Pendleton Act, which was originally pitched as a way to fight corruption. Then, in 1887, we see the very first independent board, the Interstate Commerce Commission. This power expanded dramatically during the 1930s with FDR's New Deal, which created dozens of new agencies. By 1946, the Administrative Procedure Act formally allowed these agencies to effectively write law. And finally, the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act cemented the whole system by granting these workers near immunity from being fired. It literally took a century to build this structure, and the Supreme Court is now actively dismantling it. Okay, on to Section 4, the shift in power. The core debate here, as outlined by our source, is a massive tug-of-war between two paradigms. On one hand, you have bureaucratic control, where unelected independent agencies run the show. On the other hand, you have voter control, where the public influences policy directly through the elected president and Congress. St. Onge argues that because the Senate filibuster so often paralyzes Congress, the president is really the primary mechanism voters have to enact change. Therefore, giving the president the power to fire agency heads, it shifts the country away from bureaucratic control and right back toward voter control. And Slaughter isn't just happening in a vacuum. It joins a whole parade of recent Supreme Court decisions like Sela, Collins, and Loper-Bright. According to the source material, all of these rulings share a common goal: to restore executive control over bureaucrats and to force Congress to actually take responsibility for writing the laws, rather than just outsourcing that job to independent agencies. It is a completely comprehensive judicial push to reorganize federal power. Finally, Section 5, Future Economic Implications. What does this mean for our wallets? In the near term, St. Onge points out a very practical effect: a likely reduction in what he calls the regulatory tax. Think about it. With the president now holding the power to fire them, agencies like the FTC and SEC are probably going to keep their heads down. They're likely to pull back on major aggressive regulatory pushes. And for businesses, less regulation means a lower invisible tax on their operations, which frees up capital and reduces compliance costs. But St. Onge takes this economic premise a step further with a frankly startling prediction. He theorizes that drastically slashing these regulations would unleash so much productivity that we just could double or even quadruple. He literally suggests that everyday jobs, like being a Starbucks barista or walking dogs, could command six-figure salaries. So hey, if you've been holding out for that luxury dog walking career, St. Onge argues this is absolutely your moment. However, the source notes there's still a pretty stubborn fight ahead. The transition of power isn't absolute just yet. Case in point, on the exact same day as the Slaughter decision, the Supreme Court actually stayed, or paused, the firing of Federal Reserve member Lisa Cook. St. Onge notes this was allegedly based on a legal technicality, but it might reveal a lingering reluctance by the court to let elected presidents completely control the Federal Reserve, which, let's face it, essentially steers the entire U.S. economy. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we are left to ponder the ultimate trajectory of these rulings. If those legal technicalities are actually resolved, will this deregulation truly trigger the massive wage boom St. Onge predicts? And crucially, is the fiercely independent Federal Reserve the very next target to answer directly to voters? It is a fascinating question, and one we are definitely going to be watching closely. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the structures around us actually work.